In the last lecture, we learned that the Enlightenment called for fundamental reform of the Ancien Regime. We also saw that 18th century philosophers disagreed on how to achieve that reform. Most, like Voltaire, expected the monarchs and ruling elites of Europe to reform themselves for the good of humanity. Out of the dictates of logic, out of self-interest, things could not continue as they were. This strikes me as being fundamentally naive. Ruling elites almost never give up privilege or short-term economic advantage for altruistic reasons or the dictates of logic or long-term interest, even when they face catastrophe. Case in point, surely everyone in America understands what a good idea it would be politically, economically, environmentally to develop replenishable sources of fuel. And yet, as of this taping, well, anyway, so it was in the 18th century. As we have seen, reform from the top was slow in coming. Monarchs were only interested in those reforms that enhanced their powers. Church leaders and nobles generally opposed them outright. In the end, the top of the great chain of being just had too much to lose. But recall that some thinkers, Rousseau in particular, had called for a clean sweep of the Ancien Regime. While revolution is too strong a word to project onto Rousseau, that is what it would take. That step was taken within his lifetime, but not in Europe. In this lecture, we address arguably the most significant and long-lasting result of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution. Now, to understand the background of the Revolution, you have to understand the situation of Britain and the British colonies at the end of the 7 Years' War. You will recall that in 1763, Britain was more or less declared the winner of the race for empire in North America. France lost almost all her American colonies. The result was national humiliation and terrible resentment at the defeat, especially the loss of Canada, as well as smoldering desire for revenge. There was also a spur to reform movements. The war had revealed the thorough inadequacy of the French military-industrial complex, and especially the French system of government finance. So Louis XV launched a reform movement. He cut government debt, he got the nobles to pay taxes, he imposed military promotion on merit, not birth. In a way, it was the 7 Years' War that revealed that perhaps the Bourbon monarchy of France really did need the Enlightenment. As it turned out, so did Britain. Britain had gained a vast empire, but also the problem of running and defending it. As you probably know, the 13 British colonies in North America had a population of about 2.5 million Europeans and Africans, and they were not used to much interference or taxation from London. This policy is sometimes referred to as salutary neglect. Nor were they used to working together. Now, to their west, there were thousands of indigenous peoples, various Indian tribes. Many of these had allied with the French. Would they get along with Britain? To the north and west, if the French government in North America was gone, if British immigrants were settling in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, don't forget that there remained some 65,000 French or French-speaking settlers, mostly around Quebec. Would they support a French return? Then Spain retained a vast empire to the south and west of the Mississippi. Would they ally with France in such an endeavor? In particular, after 1763, Britain had to pacify or contain three groups. First, the Native Americans. In 1763, a royal proclamation recognized indigenous sovereignty. Britain promised to negotiate treaties with individual tribes before allowing its colonists to settle their lands. And indeed, the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, up through Canada, was to be set aside as a tribal reserve. This was an enlightened policy, but it angered the British colonists, who, of course, had eyed that land for some time. Then there were the French Canadians. At first, the Crown wanted to impose British-type institutions, including an assembly open only to Protestants. But instead, cooler heads prevailed, and in 1774, the Parliament passed the Quebec Act. This was less democratic, but more in keeping with French traditions. It reaffirmed the old French legal system, it reaffirmed the old seigneurial system, it recognized the Roman Catholic Church, it restored the lands between the Ohio and the Mississippi, given in 1763, to the Indians. Now, this piece of legislation reconciled many French people to British rule, especially in the countryside. The British dominate the towns and trade. But once again, it produced resentment in the 13 colonies, where it was regarded as giving special favors to a conquered enemy. Finally, there were the British colonists themselves on the eastern seaboard and in the West Indies. They possessed little collective consciousness. We should really think of them as separate colonies, all with different histories and populations and economies. They were extremely diverse. In ethnicity, they were English, they were Scots, they were Irish, they were Germans. The last three groups comprise about 30% of the population. They were also Africans, mostly slaves. In religion, they were Congregationalists, the old Puritans, established in New England. The Church of England was established in the South and in the West Indies. But there were also Scots Presbyterians. The Middle Atlantic was home to Methodists and Quakers and Dutch Reformed and Lutherans. And throughout, there was a Baptist Great Awakening taking place. There was a small number of Catholics in Maryland and Delaware, and a smaller number of Jews in Rhode Island. Their economy, at least, was prosperous. The West Indies economy was, of course, a plantation slave economy which produced sugar. In the South, the same sort of economic arrangement produced cotton, tobacco, rice, and corn, for which there was a rich market in Europe. The North produced rum and refined sugar for England, wheat, cattle, fish, and wood for the West Indies, and built ships. The end of the war brought a recession that hurt everyone. Other than the war, the 13 colonies had largely been left alone by Britain. The Navigation Acts kept foreigners out and customs duties low. Colonial goods had to flow through a British port, and colonists got used to British goods. Crown taxes were low or non-existent, and central rule was light. The Crown appointed a governor who had executive powers, but they were limited. Each colony had an assembly, which, like Parliament in Britain, controlled the expenditure. In the 1680s, the Stuarts had tried to run the colonies more closely. James II consolidated the governments of the northern colonies into something called the Dominion of New England, and he appointed an enforcer as governor, Sir Edmund Andros. But as we've seen, James II was overthrown in 1688, and William III restored the powers of the assemblies. The franchise was wide. The lower house of each colonial assembly was elected by propertied males. That tradition of self-government and democracy was to be crucial in what happened next. British policy changed towards the colonies after the 7 Years' War. The rationale was that the British feared a French resurgence backed by Indian allies, and that required stationing large numbers of troops in North America. This was costly, especially since Britain still carried a large debt from the last war. And so Crown and Parliament decided that it was time for the American colonists to pay for their own protection. The first major result of this was the famous or infamous Stamp Act of 1765. It provided that all public documents had to have a stamp purchased from the government. This would be contracts, licenses, newspapers, even playing cards. Now, this added pennies to the cost of doing business in the colonies. Those pennies were earmarked to pay for the troops and ships which were intended to defend the colonies. That seems reasonable enough, doesn't it? The problem was that the Stamp Act was a public relations disaster that violated all the traditions of British rule up to this point. From the colonists' point of view, they didn't see a French threat. The French had been defeated. They were nowhere near. The colonists felt themselves less and less dependent on Britain. Why should they have to pay this tax? They saw the Stamp Act, moreover, as an arbitrary imposition of taxation. Many colonial leaders had read their Locke and their Montesquieu and their histories of the British Civil Wars. They felt themselves entitled to certain rights, among them the right to approve taxation. Now, actually, most Englishmen at this time didn't have this right. The electoral system in England was so spotty that there were whole big cities that didn't have a representative. The point here is not so much the reality of the English Constitution as its reputation of giving power to the people. In other words, Americans had bought into a myth of English freedom that was not entirely true. And so the colonists objected to the Stamp Act. Colonial assemblies condemned the act. The Sons of Liberty encouraged physical violence against stamp offices and collectors. For example, a crowd of 2,000 rioted in New York the night before implementation. A Stamp Act Congress was convened and decided that merchants should refuse to import British goods. The colonists should refuse to use the stamps. In 1766, at the behest of British merchants who were worried, Benjamin Franklin speaking to Parliament, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But it then passed a declaratory act in the same session, asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies. Now again, this seems reasonable, doesn't it? They're British colonies after all. But the colonists saw this as a gauntlet thrown down. The result over the next decade was a sort of dance. Parliament would pass a law as much to prove that it could as to raise money. The colonists would object to the law. Parliament would repeal the law and repeal the tax, but then pass another one to defend the basic principle. So, for example, in 1767, Parliament passed taxes on tea, paper, paint, lead, and glass. All necessities for building, and of course the colonies were expanding. There was a lot of building going on. The colonists responded with a boycott of British goods. In 1770, the issues around this and the boycott grew violent. British troops fired on a mob in Boston, killing 5. This is the famous Boston Massacre. In that year, Parliament repealed all these acts, but that on tea. Again, they kept the tea tax to prove that Parliament could still tax the colonies. Now, in fact, British East Indian tea, even with the tax, was still cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. Lord North's idea, the British Prime Minister, was that the colonists, realizing this, would vote with their pocketbooks. They would, in effect, accept the tax if they bought the tea. Instead, as you know, in December of 1773, the Boston Tea Party was held. A group of Boston merchants, dressed up like Indians, threw British tea into Boston Harbor. The British government and Parliament reacted with the coercive acts. They closed the port of Boston. They deprived the Massachusetts legislature of power. They imposed troops on the public. Troops were to be billeted on the public. And they also said that British officials could not be tried in local courts. In effect, this was an attempt to split the rest of the colonists from radical Massachusetts. Well, now the situation is beginning to grow tense. The First Continental Congress met in the fall of 1774. Now, some at the Congress urged the creation of a separate American Parliament, which would be loyal to King George. In other words, all we really want is representation. But Thomas Jefferson denounced all parliamentary legislation as an exercise of arbitrary power. In other words, in his mind, things had gone too far to go back to any variation of the old system. This Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and it began to coordinate resistance and gather arms. As you probably know, on the night of the 19th of April, 1775, British troops under General Thomas Gage were ordered to secure a store of guns and ammunition assembled by the colonists at Concord, Massachusetts. The colonists were warned by Paul Revere. They decided to fight back, firing from hedges and trees on British troops at Lexington, then at Concord. The British beat a hasty retreat, losing 250 soldiers. The American Revolution was on. Now, the American Revolutionary War is one of those events that has sunk deep in our collective popular consciousness. You know, it's a funny thing that movies about the American Revolutionary War, with the exception of The Patriot, are usually regarded as box office poison. This is in spite of, or maybe it's because of, the fact that the war gave us numerous archetypal images. The Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, the midnight ride of Paul Revere, the bitter winter at Valley Forge, Washington crossing the Delaware, John Paul Jones shouting to his British opposite number that he had not yet begun to fight, the spirit of '76, the founding fathers signing the Declaration of Independence. Now, all of these images amount to one thing, don't they? The gutty little colonists standing up against overwhelming odds to the might of ruthless King George and the British Empire. But the truth was, of course, a lot more complicated than that. In fact, I could make an argument that the balance of advantages and disadvantages tipped pretty heavily towards the Americans. It's true that the American colonists began the war without a central government to speak of, a professional army, or a navy. And it's true that they were fighting the British, a population of 9 million strong that had the best navy in the world, an army hardened on the plains of Europe and the forests of America during the 7 Years' War, and backed by the greatest economy in the world and the juggernaut of the fiscal military state. But remember that British forces would be fighting far from home against a people defending their own homes, and in their view, their way of life. whose leaders also had military experience from the 7 Years' War. Remember, too, that intelligence to Britain and orders back would take 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic round trip. Remember, too, that for once, the British would have no allies. No one would join their side. Most of Europe would stay neutral. The French would, in 1778, see an opportunity for revenge, as would the Spanish in 1779, and they would join the American side. That's right, I want to make an argument here that contrary to the way the war is usually presented, I would argue that this was the first and only French victory against the British of their 7 great wars together, because they had our help. If the colonists were disunited between those who saw the need for armed action and loyalists or Tories who remained loyal to Britain, so were the British. King George and his majority government under Lord North saw the need to maintain parliamentary authority over the 13 colonies, but even they were reluctant. By 1775, North was telling Parliament that he did not mean to tax America if they would submit and leave to us the constitutional right of supremacy. The quarrel would be at an end. But other Whigs, including Edmund Burke, split from the government and opposed the war as unnecessary and expensive and an attack on fellow Englishmen defending English freedoms. And maybe this is the point that Americans miss the most, I think, about the American Revolution. For all the financial and naval help of the French, it was an English revolution, fought by landowners and businessmen who were little different in culture from English country gentlemen and London and Bristol merchants, over many of the same issues: taxation, parliamentary sovereignty, freedom of expression, individual property rights, the rights of habeas corpus and equality under the law. These are the same issues, minus religion, as the British Civil Wars of the mid-17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. When the colonists rebelled against King George III, they claimed to be doing so in defense of English liberties, the martial law and billeting provisions of the Petition of Right of 1628, free trade with the empires represented by the Navigation Acts, and above all, the principle enshrined in the English Declaration of Rights of 1689, that an Englishman could not be taxed without his permission. As the great American historian Bernard Bailyn and others have shown, revolutionary pamphleteers cited in their defense Francis Bacon, Edward Coke, John Milton's political writings, Algernon Sidney, and of course, John Locke, all writings forged in the political struggles of Stuart England. When in 1768 British troops arrived in Boston, the Boston Town Meeting reacted in language that would have been familiar to any 17th century parliamentarian. The raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with the consent of Parliament, is against the law. In fact, that line was a direct crib from the Declaration of Rights. This was also an Enlightenment revolution. Listen to this letter written by George Washington to a friend reluctant to support opposition to Great Britain in October 1774. You reason from effects, not causes. Otherwise, you would not wonder at a people who are every day receiving fresh proofs of a systematic assertion of an arbitrary power, deeply planned to overturn the laws and constitution of their country and to violate the most essential and valuable rights of mankind. Compare this to Lord North's position. Clearly, the revolution was on some level a misunderstanding, or maybe a conflict of interests, not blood hatreds. The Americans were just as reluctant as the British. Continuing with Washington. It is not the wish or interest of that government, Massachusetts, or any other upon this continent, separately or collectively, to set up for independency, but this you may at the same time rely on, that none of them will ever submit to loss of those valuable rights and privileges which are essential to the happiness of every free state, and without which life, liberty, and property are rendered totally insecure. George Washington had read his John Locke. If you remember your Locke, insecurity of life, liberty, and property can only mean one thing: revolution. Now, at first, the war began badly for the colonies, but there were glimmers of hope. In June of 1775, the British broke a colonial siege of Boston, but colonial militia did inflict heavy casualties at Bunker and Breed's Hill. Also in 1775, the Continental Congress authorized an army under George Washington. That army was small and poorly supplied. It consisted of just 24,000 men. General Philip Schuyler complained that his men were, quote, weak in numbers, dispirited, naked, destitute of provisions, without camp equipage, with little ammunition, and not a single piece of cannon. Worse, militiamen who served unwillingly far from home often deserted. In March of 1776, the British abandoned Boston. In July, as you know, the colonies declared their independence. But also in July, a British force captured New York, defeating an American army at Brooklyn Heights. Washington retreated to New Jersey, and after a hard winter, on Christmas night of 1776-7, launched a surprise assault on Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. This was a needed psychological victory, but it was Benedict Arnold's resistance in upstate New York that kept the British from driving to Canada. That and the fact that General Sir William Howe used cautious tactics and that he was sympathetic to the rebel demands. The crucial year of the war was 1777. That summer, a large British force under General John Burgoyne swept down from Canada. The idea was to meet up with Howe's army sweeping north and west from New York City and cut the colonies in two. But Howe insisted on taking Philadelphia instead. That was a short-term victory that forced Washington into winter quarters at Valley Forge. And of course, during that terrible winter, 2,500 soldiers died. But it was a long-term failure to support Burgoyne. In October of 1777, Burgoyne was defeated by American forces at Saratoga, New York. At the urging of Ben Franklin, this convinced the French government that maybe the colonies were going to make it. They were viable. The French and the Spanish provided military and financial support. The colonists having secured the North, the British moved the war south, beginning in 1778. And here, they found a weakness in the American slave system. The British organized an Ethiopian regiment of former slaves and promised freedom if the British won the war. This regiment captured Savannah, Georgia in December of 1778, and most of South Carolina by the spring of 1780. But American forces launched an effective guerrilla war against the British. In 1781, Washington, reinforced by French troops under the Marquis de Lafayette, encircled British forces trying to establish a base at Yorktown, Virginia. Now, normally the Redcoats could have escaped or been supplied by the Royal Navy. But crucially in this instance, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had managed to get between the British Navy and the coast. And as a result, the British troops were blockaded from supply or escape. General Charles Lord Cornwallis surrendered the last large British army in North America. As a British regimental band played, the world turned upside down. It did indeed. It took 2 further years to bring His Majesty's government's representatives to the table, but peace and a recognition of American independence was reached at the Treaty of Paris. I know that this is our second Treaty of Paris. Diplomats like to go to Paris. You can't blame them. This one took place in 1783. Now, one would have to live on another planet to fail to realize that the American Revolution has had a profound effect on history. Below, I want to concentrate on its effects for one continent, Europe, and 3 countries, the newly founded United States of America, Great Britain, and France. First, Europe as a whole. The American Revolution was not important because it upset the previous balance of power in Europe. It didn't. It's true that French prestige and pride revived, but for reasons to be explained later, Britain remained dominant. The American Revolution was important in Europe because it demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals could be put into practice. And here, it is perhaps worth remembering that the American Revolution is really 2 events, isn't it? It's not just that war. It's also the formation of the Republic, culminating in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. America is a nation that created itself by a Declaration of Independence which followed Locke's position that government is instituted by the people, and that they do so to protect their lives, their liberties, and their property. Jefferson changed that phraseology to the pursuit of happiness, which is even more Enlightenment, isn't it? Locke also believed that the contract by which people do so can be revoked when a government fails in those responsibilities. So here, too, we follow Locke. Subsequently, the Founding Fathers followed Locke in 1787 by instituting a new contract, the U.S. Constitution, which makes all this explicit by stating for the first time in modern history that power comes not from God, not from tradition, but from we, the people. Now, in fact, the Constitutional Convention comprised 55 landowners and slave owners and merchants, but it's the thought that counts. The Constitution follows Montesquieu in establishing a government which separates and balances its powers among different branches: the executive, the president, the legislative, Congress, and the judicial, the courts, which is implied in the Constitution. It follows Voltaire in establishing a Bill of Rights which places individual freedoms over the power of the government, and in particular by establishing freedom of expression and religion, and failing to establish a state church. In fact, to attract support during the war, most colonies disestablished their state churches. The new Constitution follows Rousseau in establishing a wide franchise, adult, propertied, free males, and in reserving political power to more localized communities, the states. Perhaps it also followed an implication of Rousseau's thought in allowing the majority white population to declare black slaves only 3/5 of a person. More about that in a moment. So with every minute that the American Republic survived, it seemed to indicate that the philosophes were right, that the Ancien Régime was not immovable. But would the Republic survive? The United States of America had a pretty hard row to hoe at first. There was tremendous financial hardship and inflation after the war. The American export trade to Britain dried up. There was the loss by immigration of maybe 100,000 productive citizens. Shays' Rebellion in 1786-87 by Massachusetts farmers unable to pay their debts was a threat. Debates over federal versus states' rights, all these threatened to undo the great experiment. Two things saved the Republic: the 1787 Constitution and the prestige and steadying influence of George Washington. By Washington's death in 1799, the Republic was reasonably well established. Thanks to Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase had been made in 1803, and so the U.S. would expand westward. But at its heart, of course, was a great sin, slavery, that would take an entire civil war to expunge. In fact, to attract blacks to the revolutionary cause, northern states had abolished slavery, but it persisted in the South. Jefferson claimed that slavery was a necessary evil to maintain the Southern way of life. I think that means the essentially cushy lifestyles of plantation owners. Still, by making slavery a regional institution, the country began to isolate it, and that was, of course, the first step in making it unacceptable. What about Britain? Americans, I think, tend to think that the British are still sore about the American Revolution. In fact, it has meant far less for them than it did to us. It's true that it was a blow to British prestige. The North government fell. The Whigs launched the economical reform movement to make government cheaper and more efficient. Essentially, Edmund Burke argued that the reason you lost the war is that your government has grown corrupt. The American War also gave a spur to electoral reform in Britain. But the loss of the empire did not derail British prosperity. Britain still retained Canada, which supplied furs and timber, and the West Indies, which supplied sugar, and of course, received the slave trade. The U.S. still needed British manufactured goods. The Industrial Revolution is starting. And they needed to market their own raw materials. Let me give you some statistics. On the one hand, growth in exports from the 13 colonies to Great Britain stagnated right after the war. In 1770, exports from America to Great Britain stood at 1 million pounds. In 1790, they stood at 1.2 million pounds. They didn't really start growing again until 1800, when they reached 2.4 million. This hurt Americans. On the other hand, exports of manufactured goods from a rapidly industrializing Britain to the 13 states soared. In 1770, the British shipped 1.9 million pounds worth of goods to America. By 1790, that was 3.4 million pounds. By 1800, it was 7.9 million pounds worth of material. In other words, Britain got all the benefits of ownership without any of the responsibilities, like defending the colonists. The outcome has an Enlightenment implication which would profoundly affect economic thought in the 19th century. In 1776, Adam Smith would argue that mercantilism was wrong, that you didn't need to own a piece of land in order to exploit or trade with it. Free trade would be the liberal rallying cry of the next century. Now, what about France? France basked in the heady enjoyment of victory over the hated British. But in fact, the American War would help to plunge the French monarchy into bankruptcy by the end of the 1780s. And so, the American Revolution made possible a second great event in European history by way of example and by way of cost. That event would sweep away the Ancien Regime and unleash forces with which Europeans are still trying to come to terms. And so did the American Revolution beget the French Revolution.